Director Patel, you dismissed some of the FBI's most decorated, most experienced agents, not because they failed their mission, not because they broke protocol, because they investigated the wrong people, at the wrong time, for the wrong administration. You fired them to protect yourself and to settle personal scores. Can you prove otherwise, right here, right now, in front of the American people? That was the question hanging over Kash Patel before he even sat down. And what happened next revealed more about American law enforcement in 7 seconds than most oversight hearings reveal in 7 hours. But before we get to that moment, we need to go back to where this story actually begins. Because what Representative Deborah Ross pulled out of that folder wasn't just a document, it was a trap. And Patel had spent the previous 6 months walking directly into it. Kash Patel entered the Rayburn House office building that morning, wearing the confidence of a man who believed he had already survived the worst. His team had prepared him for the standard oversight playbook. What they had not prepared him for was a congressman who had spent the previous weeks doing something far more dangerous than preparing questions. Because what she had built in those weeks wasn't a line of questioning, it was a prosecution. And Patel was about to walk straight into it. Representative Deborah Ross had not spent the previous weeks preparing questions about statistics. She had spent them doing something far more methodical and far more dangerous. She had gone back through every word Kash Patel had ever said under oath, every written submission, every confirmation questionnaire, every moment his mouth had moved on the record, and the transcript preserved exactly what came out of it. And what she found in those transcripts was the kind of contradiction that doesn't just embarrass a witness, it dismantles them. 6 months before this hearing, during his Senate confirmation, Patel had raised his right hand and made promises that were precise enough to be tested. Not vague political aspirations, not the kind of language designed to sound good without meaning anything. Specific, concrete, sworn commitments that a prosecutor could hold up in a courtroom. There will be no politicization at the FBI, he had declared, his voice carrying the conviction of a man who expected to be believed. There will be no retributive actions taken by the FBI, should I be confirmed. He didn't stop there. In his written Senate questionnaire, the kind of document that carries the same legal weight as a sworn affidavit, Patel added language so specific, it read like a personal guarantee. Personnel decisions would be based on performance and adherence to law. Every FBI employee would be held to the same standard. No one, his words, not Ross's, no one would be terminated for case assignments, because Ross hadn't just read them, she had tested each one, agent by agent, case by case, name by name. And the first name she placed on that table would stop the room cold. She didn't open with an accusation. That was what made her approach so effective. The restraint of a prosecutor who knows she doesn't need theatrics because the evidence speaks at a volume that drama cannot match. She started with a hypothetical that sounded almost generous. Would firing agents based on their political affiliation constitute politicization of the FBI, or would Patel categorize that as a performance-based personnel decision? Patel gave the answer his staff had prepared. Smooth, deflective. The FBI doesn't inquire into applicants' political affiliations. Case closed. Then Ross reached into that folder. Are you aware, she asked, her voice carrying none of the combativeness the moment deserved, that in the lawsuit filed against you and the FBI by Mr. Driscoll, agents were asked who they voted for? The pen in Patel's hand stopped moving, not dramatically, not visibly enough for a camera to catch in a single frame, but those who were watching closely enough saw it, the subtle freeze of a man who has just realized the conversation has moved somewhere he didn't prepare for. He retreated behind the only available shield, ongoing litigation. He couldn't comment. Legal constraints, proper procedures. Ross let him finish. She gave him the full space to complete that sentence, and then she said, with the kind of calm that is more devastating than fury, well, that also means you just said that what happened in his situation didn't happen. 3 seconds of silence. Then, so we'll go on to the next question. And the next question was worse. Brian Driscoll. Ross spoke the name with the deliberate patience of someone laying the first piece of evidence before a jury. Driscoll was not a peripheral figure. He was not a minor bureaucrat who had wandered into the wrong political crossfire. He was a nearly 20-year veteran of the FBI, the kind of institutional memory that agencies spend decades building and cannot replace. He had earned the Medal of Valor, the Bureau's highest recognition for bravery, during a counter-terrorism operation involving an active ISIS threat. He had led the FBI's Critical Incident Response Group, the unit that deploys to the most catastrophic, most complex national emergencies, the moments when failure has consequences that are measured in lives. He had been asked, during his interview for a senior role at the Bureau, who he had voted for. In the last 5 elections, he refused to answer, not because he had something to hide, because those questions corrupt the neutrality of an institution whose entire operational value depends on being seen as neutral. So he was let go. Patel's response was a retreat into procedure. The FBI doesn't terminate anyone based on case assignments alone. The carefully constructed non-answer of a man who knows every word he speaks is being transcribed, evaluated, and compared against something he said 6 months earlier under oath. Ross didn't let it land unchallenged. Has the FBI ever been sued by someone who felt they were terminated based on case assignments? Since your tenure in the... Patel's voice, when the answer came, was quieter than it had been at any point in that hearing. Yes, in fact, there is ongoing litigation. The press gallery heard it. Every Democratic staffer heard it. And for just a fraction of a second, the kind of fraction that high-definition cameras are very good at preserving, Patel looked like a man who had realized too late that the ground beneath him had been giving way for some time. But Driscoll was only the first name, Steve Jensen. Ross spoke the second name with the same measured calm. Jensen's career had been built in the spaces that most Americans never see: terrorism investigations, counterintelligence operations, organized crime networks. The infrastructure of national security that functions precisely because the people maintaining it operate without public recognition. Here is the detail that gave this particular firing its specific weight. Kash Patel, not a Democratic opponent, not a critic, not a journalist, Patel himself had publicly described Jensen as someone who embodies what the American public demands of the FBI. His words, his public praise, his characterization of a man whose career he would later terminate. Why was Jensen removed? Because he had worked on investigations related to January 6th, because online political pressure mounted against him from constituencies that Patel could not afford to ignore. And within weeks of that pressure becoming public, Jensen was gone. The man Patel had held up as the embodiment of FBI excellence became a liability to be managed. But Jensen wasn't the last name in that folder. And the third one carried a weight that even the most seasoned reporters in that press gallery weren't prepared for. The bureaucratic armor that Patel had been wearing through this hearing, the composure, the technical language, the retreat into process, was visibly thinning. His senior staff behind him had stopped making eye contact with each other, which is what people do when they have understood that the situation has moved beyond anything they prepared for. Walter Jardia. His offense was not misconduct. It was not a performance failure. He had worked on investigations related to Russian interference in the 2016 election, and he had been part of the team that built cases touching Trump ally Peter Navarro. That was enough. Jardia was removed. A man who had spent his career doing exactly what the FBI is supposed to do, following the evidence wherever it leads, regardless of who it leads to, was pushed out because the evidence had led somewhere politically inconvenient. 3 careers representing, collectively, more than half a century of service to the American public. 3 firings, and a pattern so consistent that by the time Ross had finished laying it out, it required no interpretation. Every person removed had worked on investigations that were politically inconvenient, not misconduct, not performance failures, not protocol violations, politically inconvenient cases. She looked at Patel then, and what came next was not posed as a question. Director Patel, it is very clear that you have flunked your own test. 7 seconds of silence. You put saving your job over doing what's right for the FBI and the American people. That is not adherence to the law. What Ross demonstrated is how institutional corruption actually operates. Not with a single dramatic order that creates headlines, with a sequence of individually defensible decisions, each wrapped in the language of process, each pointing in exactly the same direction, until the pattern becomes the proof. No confession needed. The pattern is the confession. But the official record only tells part of the story, because what was happening inside the bureau, behind closed doors, away from cameras, was something Ross had only begun to surface. There is one more dimension this hearing only partially surfaced, and it matters because it speaks to something larger than any single firing. An FBI director is not merely an administrator. The office carries institutional weight that shapes how 35,000 agents understand their own conduct. The public perception of that office, its dignity, its credibility, is an operational asset. When the director becomes a recurring subject of controversy, unrelated to law enforcement, something essential in the institution's authority begins to erode. Career agents watching from field offices across the country were not watching an abstract political confrontation. An FBI director is permitted a personal life. What he is not permitted, and what 35,000 agents are owed, is a director who becomes tabloid material. The embarrassing headlines about personal conduct, the entertainment world controversies, the stories about judgment failures that have nothing to do with national security. Agents have been watching all of it from their field offices, in silence, because speaking up now costs careers. That silence is its own kind of damage. Ross was articulating what many inside the bureau had been living with privately for months. The standard was never imposed by opponents. Kash Patel wrote it himself, in sworn testimony, in official questionnaires, before his hand was raised for the oath. He authored the criteria. He failed to meet them, and on a Tuesday morning, a representative from North Carolina read those criteria back to him, word for word, and waited. The answer that came was silence. The implications extend well beyond the exchange itself. When a law enforcement director cannot defend his own stated standards, when the evidence against him consists entirely of his own words, the credibility damage is not recovered through press releases or subsequent testimony. The transcript is permanent. The names of 3 agents whose careers ended are now on the record, next to a timeline that makes the direction of every decision impossible to dispute. Ross demonstrated something worth understanding, regardless of political affiliation, that congressional oversight, conducted with preparation rather than theater, remains the most powerful accountability tool in the American system. She didn't need leaked documents. She didn't need anonymous sources. She needed a printed copy of Patel's confirmation testimony and the professional histories of 3 people whose careers ended for reasons that, by Patel's own written standard, had nothing to do with performance. Which brings us to the question we're leaving with you today. So here is the only question that matters now. Is Kash Patel running the FBI, or is he just holding the door open for whoever tells him to? And how long before the administration that placed him in that chair decides he's become more liability than asset? Drop your answer below, because the agents still inside that bureau are watching what the public thinks, and right now, they're counting.